There is a man sitting in ashes, real ashes, the kind that get into your skin and stay there. He has been sitting in them long enough that the people who knew him best walked up and did not recognize him. He had children. He does not anymore. He had a home, livestock, workers, a life that looked like evidence of a good God keeping his word. Gone, all of it gone. His body is covered in sores from the soles of his feet to the top of his head. He has a piece of broken pottery that he uses to scrape his own skin because the pain is that constant and that specific. And his wife, the woman who lost the same children he lost, who watched the same life collapse that he watched collapse, looked at him and said, the most honest thing anyone says in the first 2 chapters of this book. She said, just curse God and die. That is where we are starting. Because here is what makes the book of Job different from almost every other conversation about suffering you have ever heard. Job had done nothing wrong. That is not a detail. That is the whole problem. If you have ever sat in your own version of those ashes and wondered why, if you have ever prayed and heard nothing back, if you have ever watched someone you love go through something that had no explanation and no warning and no apparent reason, then this book was written for you. 16 chapters, 1 book, 1 man who refused to lie about his pain, and a God who called that honesty the truth. Stay with it. The book of Job opens with a description that most people read too fast. In the land of Uz, there was a man whose name was Job. He was blameless and upright, a man who feared God and turned away from evil. 4 things: blameless, upright, feared God, turned away from evil. The writer is not being casual here. This is a deliberate, careful, almost aggressive introduction. Because the story that follows only carries the weight it carries if you cannot explain away what happens to this man by pointing to something he did wrong. If Job had a secret sin, the whole book collapses. His friends would be right. The system would hold. Suffering equals punishment. Faithfulness equals protection. And the universe makes a kind of clean moral sense that you can teach in a single sermon and walk away from feeling settled. But Job does not have a secret sin. The text will not let you find one. And that is what makes this one of the most uncomfortable books ever written. We want there to be a reason, not because we are cruel, because we are afraid. If a man, this righteous, can lose everything without a reason we can identify, then none of us are standing on the ground we think we are standing on. Job had 7 sons and 3 daughters. He owned 7,000 sheep, 3,000 camels, 500 yoke of oxen, 500 donkeys, and a very large household. The text says he was the greatest man among all the people of the East. He was generous. He was careful. He was the kind of father who got up early in the morning to offer sacrifices on behalf of his children, just in case they had sinned in their hearts the night before. He thought about things like that. This is not a careless man. This is not a man coasting on inherited faith or going through religious motions while his actual life runs in a different direction. Job was the real thing. And the writer of this book wants you to know that before a single thing goes wrong, because the first truth this story teaches does not come from Job's suffering. It comes from who Job was before the suffering started. The righteous can suffer without a simple reason. This is the truth that every easy theology has to find a way around. The health and wealth gospel has to find a way around it. The idea that your level of faith determines your level of protection has to find a way around it. The quiet instinct that tells you there must be something they are not telling you about why that good person got that diagnosis, has to find a way around it. Job is the book that refuses to let any of those detours work. You cannot read the opening of Job honestly and walk away believing that suffering is always a signal. Sometimes it is. Scripture elsewhere makes room for consequences, for discipline, for the natural results of choices made over time. But Job exists specifically to break open the assumption that suffering is always traceable to something the sufferer did or failed to do. That assumption was old in his day. His friends believed it completely. They were educated, serious, spiritually thoughtful men. And every one of them walked into that ash heap carrying that assumption like it was the most reliable piece of theology they owned. They were wrong, and the book is going to show you exactly how wrong and exactly what that wrongness costs the person on the receiving end of it. But before it does that, it takes you somewhere. Job never got to go. There is a scene at the beginning of this book that Job never got to read. You do. He did not. One day the angels came to present themselves before God, and the accuser came with them. The Hebrew word used here is hasatan, which means the adversary, the one who opposes, the one who brings charges. This is a prosecutorial role, a challenger, someone whose function is to test the integrity of what God claims. And God opens the conversation by bringing up Job. Have you considered my servant Job? There is no one on earth like him. He is blameless and upright, a man who fears God and turns away from evil. God initiates this. That matters. God points to Job first. God is the one who names him. The accuser's response is a question, and it is one of the most penetrating questions in the entire Bible. Does Job fear God for nothing? Think about what that question is actually asking. It is not asking whether Job is faithful. It is asking why Job is faithful. It is asking whether the faith is real in the way that actually matters. Whether it is rooted in God himself or in the life that God has provided. It is asking whether Job would still be Job if the blessings disappeared. Have you not put a hedge around him and his household and everything he has? You have blessed the work of his hands so that his flocks and herds are spread throughout the land. But now stretch out your hand and strike everything he has, and he will surely curse you to your face. It is a cynical argument, but it is not a stupid one. The accuser is pointing to something real. It is easy to love a God who is giving you everything you want. It is easy to show up to worship when worship has been comfortable, and your prayers have generally been answered in the ways you hoped, and your life looks like evidence that following God pays off. The question is, what happens to that fancy when the evidence changes? Does Job fear God for nothing? That question is not just about Job. Every person watching this is somewhere inside that question. Because at some point, for almost everyone, the blessings get interrupted. The hedge has gaps in it. The life that felt like confirmation of your faith starts to feel like anything but. And what is left when that happens is either a faith that was always about the gifts or a faith that was always about the giver. Job is about to find out which kind he has. But here is the thing that will stay under this entire story like a foundation most people never see. God agrees to the test. He allows the hedge to come down. He permits what is about to happen. And then he says one thing he will not say again in the book. At least, not directly to Job. He calls Job his servant 4 times in 2 verses. My servant Job. My servant Job. That designation does not go away. It will still be there at the end of the book. On the other side of everything Job is about to go through, God does not revoke it. He does not walk it back. What happens next is going to feel like abandonment from where Job is sitting. But from where the reader is sitting, before the first disaster even arrives, the record already shows that God has not let go of what he calls Job. Job will never know this conversation happened. He will never know he was the subject of it. He will never know that his name was the one God brought up, that his faith was the one God pointed to, that the question being tested was not whether he deserved what was coming, but whether his love for God was the kind that could survive it. He will go through everything that follows without that information. Hold on to that, because it is going to matter more than almost anything else in this story. The disasters come in waves, not one at a time, not with space between them for Job to absorb each blow and find his footing before the next one arrives. They come in a sequence so close together that the messengers overlap. One is still speaking when the next one arrives. A messenger comes and tells Job that his oxen and donkeys were stolen, and the servants caring for them were killed by the sword. While he is still talking, a second messenger arrives. Fire fell from the sky and burned up the sheep and the servants tending them. While that man is still speaking, a third arrives. Raiders took all the camels and killed those servants too. And then the fourth messenger, your sons and daughters were eating and drinking wine at their oldest brother's house when a great wind swept in from the desert and struck the four corners of the house. It collapsed on them. They are all dead. Read that sequence and notice something. Job does not get a pause. The text is structured so that there is no breath between these messages. One is still arriving when the next one comes. The effect is not accidental. This is what sudden catastrophic loss actually feels like from the inside. There is no time to process one thing before the next thing is already there. Job got up and tore his robe and shaved his head. Then he fell to the ground in worship. That word matters. Worship, not after he had processed it, not after the grief had settled into something manageable. In the middle of it, on the ground, with the news still in the air, he said, "Naked I came from my mother's womb, and naked I will depart. The Lord gave, and the Lord has taken away. May the name of the Lord be praised." Most people have heard that verse used as a model response to grief, a template for how a faithful person handles loss. And it is remarkable. It is real. Job meant every word of it. But do not let the familiarity of that verse make you read past what comes next. The suffering is not finished. The accuser returns. He argues that physical suffering is a different test than material loss, that a man will give everything he has to save his own life, that if God allows Job's body to be afflicted, then Job will curse God to his face. God agrees to this second test as well. He places one boundary: Job's life must be spared. And Job is afflicted with terrible sores, from the soles of his feet to the crown of his head. Now pay attention to his wife. She has watched all of this happen. She lost the same children Job lost. She lost the same household. And now she is watching the man who is left to her sitting in an ash heap, scraping his own skin with broken pottery, his body unrecognizable, his life reduced to something she could not have imagined a week earlier. When she says, "Curse God and die," most people read her as the villain of this opening. Some commentators through history have been remarkably unkind to her. She is not a villain. She is a mother who has just buried all 10 of her children, and she is watching her husband suffer in a way she cannot stop. and she has reached the end of what she knows how to hold. What she says is wrong, but it is human in a way that deserves more compassion than it usually receives. Job's response to her is gentle. He calls her foolish, not wicked. He says, "Shall we accept good from God and not trouble?" And then the text gives us one of the most important lines in the entire opening of this book. In all this, Job did not sin in what he said. Not yet. What comes next will be harder. For Job and for everyone reading this. But in the first wave of it, on the ground and in the ash heap and in the conversation with his wife, Job did not sin in what he said. Hold on to that too, because there is a version of this story that would demand Job stay in that verse for the entire book. There is a version that would make his ongoing silence the model and his eventual speech the failure. The book does not tell that version. The God of this book is not afraid of what Job is about to say. And that means something important about what kind of God this is, and what kind of relationship this book is actually describing. Job did not curse God, but he opened his mouth, and what came out of it was not a psalm. It was something older and rawer than that, something that was going to make his friends very uncomfortable very quickly. And it was something that God, at the end of all of it, was going to call the truth. They came from a distance. Eliphaz from Teman, Bildad from Shua, Zophar from Naamah. 3 men who had known Job before any of this happened, who had agreed to meet together and go to comfort him in his suffering. They had heard about what happened. They had talked about it among themselves and made a plan to go to their friend. When they saw him from a distance, they did not recognize him. That detail should stop you. These were men who knew Job, men who had spent time with him, who knew what he looked like, who had shared meals and conversations and probably a great deal of life with him. And when they looked at him across the distance, they could not tell who he was. Grief had done that. Suffering had done that. The sorries. Yes, but something else too. There is a way that profound loss changes a person's face, their posture, the way they hold themselves in the world. Job was not the same person they had known, and they could see it before they were even close enough to speak. They tore their robes. They sprinkled dust on their heads toward the sky, and then they sat down on the ground with him. For 7 days and 7 nights they sat with him. No one said a word, because they saw how great his suffering was. That is what the text says. Not that they were waiting for the right moment, not that they were quietly preparing their arguments. They looked at what had happened to their friend, and they understood, at least in that first moment, that there were no words for it. 7 days of silence. In the ancient Near East, 7 days was the traditional period of mourning for the dead. They were sitting Shiva with a man who was still breathing. They were treating his suffering as a kind of death, because that is what it was. They did not explain. They did not offer perspective. They did not remind him that God was still good, or that things would get better, or that he needed to look at what he still had. They did not quote scripture at him, or tell him everything happens for a reason, or suggest that God must be trying to teach him something. They sat on the ground with him in the ash heap, and for 7 days, that was enough. For 7 days, they were the friends they came to be. There is a reason this detail has stayed in the text for thousands of years. There is a reason that after all the theology and argument and divine speeches that fill the rest of this book, these 7 days still stand out as a moment of something almost holy. Presence is not a lesser form of help. It is sometimes the only form of help that does not make things worse. The instinct to speak when someone is suffering is almost overwhelming. especially for people of faith. We have things we believe, truths we hold on to, frameworks that have carried us through our own hard seasons. And when someone we love is suffering, all of that rises up and wants to be useful. We want to give them something they can hold. We want to say the thing that helps. But Job was past the place where words could reach him. And his friends, in those first 7 days, seemed to understand that. They came and they stayed and they did not say anything. And for 7 days, that was the most faithful thing they could have done. For 7 days, they were almost wise. Then they began to speak. And the moment they opened their mouths, everything that made those 7 days valuable started to come apart. Job speaks first. He does not curse God. He curses the day he was born. May the day of my birth perish. May the night that said a boy is conceived be darkness. Why did I not perish at birth? Why did I not die as I came from the womb? This is not a man asking a calm theological question. This is a man who wishes he had never existed, because existing has brought him to this ash heap, to this body full of sores, to this silence where his children used to be. And this is the moment his friends decide they have been quiet long enough. What they say next will reveal something about all of us, something most people never name, something that lives underneath the kind of theology we build when we are comfortable, and only shows its real shape when someone we love refuses to suffer in a way that keeps our theology intact. That is where we are going next. Eliphaz speaks first. He is the oldest, probably, and the most careful. He opens gently. If someone ventures a word with you, will you be impatient? But who can keep from speaking? That sentence is worth sitting with. Who can keep from speaking? As if the 7 days of silence had become a burden that finally had to be relieved. As if Job's raw honesty was something that needed to be responded to, contained, redirected back towards safer theological ground. Eliphaz has a vision to share. A spirit glided past his face in the night, and the spirit told him something. Can a mortal be more righteous than God? Can even a strong man be more pure than his maker? The argument is building. Eliphaz is moving Job toward a conclusion without yet saying it directly. He talks about how even God's angels are charged with error, how those who dwell in houses of clay are crushed more readily than a moth, how people perish for lack of wisdom. And then he lands the point. If I were you, I would appeal to God. I would lay my cause before him. He performs wonders that cannot be fathomed. He provides rain for the earth. He thwarts the plans of the crafty. He saves the needy from the clutches of the powerful. Hear what he is doing. He is telling Job what Job should do. He is reframing Job's suffering as a problem that has a solution. And the solution is to appeal to God correctly. And the implication underneath all of it is that if Job had been doing that already, things might look different. Bildad follows. He is less careful than Eliphaz. When your children sinned against him, he gave them over to the penalty of their sin. That sentence lands like a stone. Your children sinned. That is why they died. God was just. The system worked exactly as it should. And if Job would just seek God earnestly, if Job would just be pure and upright, then God would restore him. Zophar is the bluntest of all. Know this, Job, God has even forgotten some of your sin. What he is saying, plainly, is that Job is getting less than he deserves. That the suffering Job is experiencing is actually God going easy on him. One of Job's comforters tells him his suffering is mercy. Now step back from what they are saying and look at the structure of it. Every one of them arrives at the same destination by a slightly different road. Eliphaz gets there through a vision. Bildad gets there through tradition and history. Zophar gets there through blunt declaration. But all three of them are building the same thing, a theological system in which Job's suffering has to be Job's fault. And here is the thing that makes this so important for us to sit with honestly. They are not entirely wrong about their theology in the abstract. There is real wisdom in the tradition they are drawing from. There is truth in the idea that God is just. There is truth in the idea that actions have consequences. The book of Proverbs, which lives just a few shelves down from Job in the wisdom literature, says many of the things these men are saying. In a general sense, across the arc of a life, faithfulness and wisdom do tend toward flourishing. That is real. The problem is not that their theology is false everywhere. The problem is that they are applying it to a specific person in a specific situation where it does not fit. And they are applying it with a certainty that the situation does not warrant. And they are applying it to a man who is in agony and who did not ask to be argued at. They came to comfort Job. They ended up putting him on trial. And there is a reason that happened. There is a reason it was almost inevitable once they opened their mouths. If Job is innocent and suffering anyway, their world falls apart. Think about what it would mean for Eliphaz if he accepted that Job had done nothing to deserve this. It would mean that his own comfortable life was not evidence of his own righteousness. It would mean that the hedge around him could come down for no reason he could identify or prevent. It would mean that the universe was not as orderly and predictable as his theology required. That is terrifying. And the easiest way to avoid that terror is to find something wrong with Job. They came because they cared. But fear dressed itself up in the language of wisdom and tradition and concern for their friend's soul. And it became the most harmful thing that happened to Job after the disasters themselves. The most dangerous response to suffering is not cruelty. It is certainty. The settled conviction that you know what God is doing in someone else's ash heap. The comfortable assurance that if they would just see it the right way, if they would just apply the right framework, the suffering would resolve into a lesson they could learn from and move past. Sometimes it is not a lesson. Sometimes it is just suffering. And the most faithful response to that kind of suffering is the one Job's friends managed for exactly 7 days before they ruined it. Sit down. Stay. Say nothing. Job is not finished talking yet. And what he says next is going to be one of the most honest things anyone in Scripture ever said out loud. Before we go any further with Job's friends, we need to talk about something that lives underneath their arguments. Something most people never name. These were not cold men. They were not indifferent. They traveled to be with Job. They sat in silence with him for 7 days. Whatever happened after that, the beginning of their presence was an act of real friendship. They cared about this man. So why did they do what they did? Why did 3 people who genuinely loved their friend spend chapter after chapter trying to convince him that his suffering was his own fault? The answer is not that they were cruel. The answer is that they were scared. Here is what Job's situation actually threatened. Not just for his friends, but for anyone who took it seriously. Job was righteous. The text established that beyond argument, and Job lost everything anyway, which means that righteousness is not a guarantee, which means that the life you have built, the faith you have maintained, the choices you have made carefully, over decades of trying to live well, none of that is necessarily protection against the kind of loss Job experienced. If Job is innocent, the flaw disappears. And human beings, when the flaw disappears, do not usually sit calmly in the uncertainty. They find a new flaw fast, even if they have to build it out of something that is not entirely true. Blaming Job gave his friends a flaw. If Job did something wrong, if there is a hidden sin or an overlooked failure or some area where his faith was weaker than it appeared, then the system still works. Then righteousness still protects. Then their own lives are still standing on solid ground. Then what happened to Job is a cautionary lesson, not a terrifying demonstration that falling short had nothing to do with it. This is not a phenomenon that ended with 3 men in the ancient Near East. You have seen this in your own life. Someone gets a diagnosis that makes no sense. And someone else says, well, they never really took care of themselves. Someone loses their marriage, and people who barely knew them start talking about what they must have done wrong at home. Someone goes through financial ruin, and the quiet conversation afterward is about the decisions they should have made differently. Someone loses a child, and in certain religious circles, the whispers start about whether they had enough faith, whether they prayed the right way, whether there was something in their spiritual life that left them exposed. Almost none of those responses come from hatred. Almost all of them come from fear. Because if it can happen to someone who did everything right, then it can happen to you. And that is not a thought most people know how to live with. So instead of living with it, they find the reason. They locate the fault. They build the flaw back out of the suffering person's guilt. And they stand on it. And they feel safer. And they have no idea what they just did to the person they are standing on. Psychologists have a name for part of this. They call it the just world hypothesis. The deep human need to believe that the world is fundamentally fair, that people get what they deserve and deserve what they get. It is one of the most persistent patterns in human experience, and it is one of the most harmful when it gets applied to people in crisis. Job's friends were not unique. They were human, and that is exactly what makes them so dangerous as a model. Bad theology that comes from fear sounds almost identical to good theology that comes from wisdom. It uses the same words. It quotes the same texts. It arrives with the same serious expression and the same genuine concern. The difference is not in the language. The difference is in what the speaker needs from the conversation. A person speaking from wisdom can afford to sit with uncertainty. They can say, I do not know why this happened to you. They can hold the mystery without needing to resolve it at the expense of the person suffering. They can be present without needing the suffering to make sense. A person speaking from fear cannot do any of those things. They need the suffering to make sense. They need a reason. And if the person in front of them will not provide one, they will construct one from whatever theological materials are available. Job's friends constructed one. They constructed it carefully and at length over multiple chapters. And every time Job pushed back, every time he refused to accept their verdict, they pushed harder, because his refusal threatened the floor they were standing on. And here is the layer that is hardest to sit with. Sometimes the people who need the wounded to be guilty are the ones who love them most. The people who showed up. The people who sat in silence for 7 days. The people who genuinely wanted their friend to be okay and genuinely believed that what they were saying was the path toward okay. Love does not automatically protect you from this. Concern does not automatically protect you from this. Even serious theological knowledge does not automatically protect you from this. Because this is not primarily a knowledge problem. It is a fear problem. And fear has a way of working through the very things you trust most. Your relationships, your traditions, your faith, your desire to help, and turning them into instruments of harm without ever announcing what it is doing. This is what Job's friends did, not because they were bad, because they were human and afraid, and they had a theology that could not afford to be wrong. Job could see it. He pushed back against it through chapter after chapter with a ferocity that surprised everyone around him. Because Job understood something his friends had not yet grasped. Accepting a false explanation for your suffering is not humility. It is a different kind of lie. And Job, whatever else he was going through, was not willing to lie. Here is what Job says to his friends at one point in these exchanges. Will you speak wickedly on God's behalf? Will you speak deceitfully for him? Will you show him partiality? Will you argue the case for God? Will it go well when he examines you? Could you deceive him as you might deceive a human being? Read that carefully. Job is not accusing his friends of being irreligious. He is accusing them of something that religious people rarely see as a danger. He is accusing them of lying for God, of defending a theological position that does not match the reality in front of them because they think that is what faithfulness requires. And Job's argument is that this is not faithfulness. This is the opposite of faithfulness. Because a God who is actually true does not need you to misrepresent reality to protect his reputation. A God who is actually just does not need you to falsely convict an innocent man to keep his justice looking clean. Job is saying your certainty is not honoring God. It is protecting yourselves, and I will not join you in it. This is a remarkable thing for a man in his position to say. Job has nothing left. No wealth, no children, no health. He is covered in sores and sitting in ashes, and his body has become unrecognizable to the people who knew him. He has every practical reason in the world to say what his friends want to hear. Agreeing with them would end the argument. It would restore the friendship. It would at minimum stop the relentless pressure of being told over and over that his suffering is his fault. But Job will not do it. He says, though he slay me, yet will I hope in him. And then, in the same breath, in the very next clause, yet I will surely defend my ways to his face. Both things at once. I trust him, and I will not pretend my case is not what it is. That is not contradiction. That is the most honest theology in the entire book. Job is holding together two things that his friends have decided cannot coexist: faith in God and honesty about his own experience. Trust in God's character and refusal to falsify his own innocence. His friends have separated those things. In their framework, real faith means accepting that Job must have done something wrong, because that is what the system requires. Defending his own integrity, in their view, is a form of pride or rebellion. A truly humble man would submit to the verdict of his suffering. Job refuses that framework completely. He refuses it, not because he has stopped trusting God, but because he trusts God enough to be honest with him. There is a kind of faith so small that it can only survive if no hard questions are ever asked of it. Job does not have that kind of faith. His faith is large enough to contain his anger, his confusion, his insistence that something has gone wrong that he cannot explain. He says, "My face has grown red with weeping. Deep darkness covers my eyes. Yet my hands have been free of violence, and my prayer is pure." My prayer is pure. In the middle of everything, after the losses and the sores and the argument and the silence, my prayer is pure. He is not claiming perfection. He is saying that whatever happened to him did not happen because of the specific hidden corruption his friends are insisting must be there. And he will not sign a confession for a crime he did not commit just to make their theology work. There is a word for what Job is doing, a word that has been badly misunderstood in many religious contexts. Lament. Lament is not the absence of faith. Lament is faith talking honestly under pressure. It is what happens when a person who genuinely believes in a God who is good and just and present encounters circumstances that feel like evidence against all three of those things. And instead of resolving that tension by lying, they bring the tension directly to God and refuse to let go of either side. Job laments. He laments loudly and at length, and with language that makes his friends flinch. He says things in these chapters that push right up against the edge of what any of us would feel comfortable saying to God. He talks about God multiplying his wounds without cause. He talks about feeling hunted. He talks about wanting to present his case directly, wanting to know the charges against him, wanting an answer, and God does not strike him down for it. Not once. In all of these chapters where Job is saying things that his friends find outrageous, does God interrupt and tell him to be quiet? The silence of God during this section of the book is complete, but it is not the silence of disapproval. It is something else entirely. It is the silence of a God who is not afraid of what his servant is saying. And that matters enormously, because the God who is not afraid of Job's lament is also not afraid of yours. The faith tradition that preserved these chapters, that kept them in the canon, that decided these words were worth passing down through every generation, was making a statement about what God can hold. God can hold your anger. He can hold your confusion. He can hold your "where are you?" and your "why did you let this happen?" and your "this is not what I was told to expect from you." He has held all of those things from his people across thousands of years of suffering. What he asks, what Job models, even in the hardest moments, is not that you pretend to feel something you do not feel. It is that you bring what you actually feel to him, rather than to the empty air. Job's friends wanted him to perform a grief that fit their theology. A grief that was humble and quiet and quick to find the lesson and move toward restoration on a reasonable timeline. A grief that did not ask uncomfortable questions or make anyone else in the room feel the full weight of what had actually happened. Job would not perform that grief, and the God who saw all of it called it, at the end of the book, the truth. Job wants a hearing, not comfort, not explanation, not even relief, though he would take that. What Job wants, in the deepest part of these middle chapters, is a chance to present his case, a formal opportunity to stand before the God he believes in and say, "Here is what happened to me, and here is what I know about myself. And I need you to tell me what I am missing because I cannot find it." The Hebrew word Job uses in these sections is rib. It is a legal term, a covenant lawsuit. The kind of language used when one party in an agreement believes the other party has violated the terms and is calling for an accounting. Job is not using this language carelessly. He understands himself to be in a covenant relationship with God, a relationship with terms and obligations on both sides. And from where Job is sitting, something in that relationship has broken down in a way he cannot explain. And he wants the conversation that a broken covenant deserves. He says, "I desire to speak to the Almighty and to argue my case with God." Then he says something that stops most careful readers cold. He says, "Even now my witness is in heaven. My advocate is on high. My intercessor is my friend, as my eyes pour out tears to God. On behalf of a man, he pleads with God as one pleads for a friend. Job is asking for a mediator, someone who can stand between him and God and make the conversation possible. Someone who can put a hand on both sides of the divide and hold them together long enough for Job to be heard. He does not know if such a person exists. He is asking the question out loud because he has no other place to ask it. This moment in Job is one of the most quietly astonishing things in all of wisdom literature. A man in the ancient Near East, sitting in ashes, with no New Testament in front of him and no developed theology of intercession available to him, reaches forward through the darkness of his own suffering and asks whether there is someone who can stand between a broken human being and a God who has gone silent. He is asking for exactly what he does not yet know is coming. But that is not the part of Job's lawsuit that most people sit with long enough. The part that matters most is why Job keeps pressing the case at all. His friends have essentially told him the case is closed. The verdict is in. He suffered, which means he sinned, which means there is nothing to argue. The proper response is confession and repentance, not litigation. They are genuinely baffled by his refusal to accept that framework. But Job will not stop pushing. He will not accept a verdict he knows is wrong. He will not close the case just because everyone around him has decided it is finished. And the reason he will not close it is the same reason the lawsuit language matters so much. Job still believes in justice. If Job had lost his faith in God's justice, he would have stopped talking. There would be nothing left to press the case toward. You do not file a lawsuit against a judge you have no faith in. You do not demand a hearing from a court you believe is corrupt beyond repair. Job keeps pressing because he still believes the court is real. He still believes the judge is ultimately just. He still believes that his case, if it could actually be heard, would be vindicated. His faith in God's justice is so strong that he cannot stop pushing against the silence. The very intensity of his complaint is evidence of the very faith his friends are accusing him of lacking. He says, "I know that my Redeemer lives, and that in the end he will stand on the earth, and after my skin has been destroyed, yet in my flesh I will see God. I myself will see him with my own eyes. How my heart yearns within me. How my heart yearns within me." That is not the sentence of a man who has given up on God. That is the sentence of a man who is so convinced that God is real and ultimately just that the silence is unbearable, precisely because of that conviction. If Job did not believe, the silence would just be silence. It would be the expected result of praying to no one. But Job believes. And so the silence is not just absence. It is a wound. A specific, targeted, personal wound that only happens to people who expected something different from the relationship they thought they had. This is what makes Job's situation different from simple grief or simple loss. Job is not just suffering. Job is suffering in the context of a relationship he trusted completely, and the silence of the person he trusted most, in the moment he needed the most, is its own category of pain that sits underneath and amplifies everything else. You may know this pain from a different direction, not from God, from a person, the friend who went quiet when the diagnosis came, the parent who was not there during the hardest years, the community that said all the right things before the crisis and had very little to say after it started, the marriage that was supposed to be a place of safety that became instead a place where you felt most alone. Silence from someone you trusted is not the same as silence from a stranger. It carries the specific gravity of a broken expectation. of a relationship that was supposed to work differently than it is currently working. Job knows that weight intimately, and he will not stop talking until someone answers him. God does not answer. Not yet. After all of it, after the disasters came in waves, and Job tore his robe and fell to the ground in worship. After his wife said what she said, and Job refused to curse God. After 7 days of silence with his friends that gave way to chapter after chapter of argument and accusation and theological debate. After Job filed his lawsuit and demanded a mediator and said his heart yearns for the moment he can stand before God and make his case. After all of that, God is quiet. There is a stretch in this book where God simply does not speak. The human voices fill the space. Job speaks. His friends respond. Job responds to them. Round after round of argument that grows sharper and more painful as it goes. And over all of it, underneath all of it, threading through every single exchange, is the silence of heaven. Most treatments of Job rush past this part. They move quickly from the disasters to the friends to the whirlwind, because the whirlwind is where the drama is. Where God finally shows up and speaks in a way that stops everyone cold. The silence in the middle feels like waiting room time. Like the part of the story you have to get through to reach the part that matters. But the silence is the part that matters. For the people in this story, there is no whirlwind yet. There is no promise that the whirlwind is coming. There is no page to flip to that tells them how far away the answer is. There is just this: the arguments, the ash heap, the stories, the memory of children who are not there anymore, and the sky that does not open. If you have ever prayed and heard nothing, you know this part of Job better than any other. The disasters are comprehensible in a way, at least from the outside. People lose things. People suffer. The world is broken, and sometimes it shows that brokenness in sudden and concentrated ways. But the silence, the specific experience of bringing your pain to the God you believe in, laying it out in full, asking for something, anything, a sign or a word or just the faintest sense of presence, and receiving nothing that you can identify as an answer. That silence is its own suffering. It is the suffering that sits inside the other suffering and makes it darker. Because loss is one thing, but loss, combined with the feeling that the one you expected to be with you in the loss is not there, that is a different weight entirely. We are halfway through Job's story, and the hardest part is not behind him yet. Job does not handle this silence perfectly. There are moments in these middle chapters where he says things that are theologically overstated. He accuses God of things that God is going to need to address later. He pushes past the boundaries of what he actually knows into the territory of what his pain is telling him must be true. His friends are wrong about almost everything. But they are not wrong that some of what Job says in these chapters goes too far. And yet, God does not interrupt him. God does not send a corrective vision. God does not use one of Job's friends as a mouthpiece to pull him back from the edge of what he is saying. The silence continues. And when God finally does speak, when the whirlwind finally comes, what God says is not that Job was right about everything. Job was not right about everything. But what God says about Job's speech compared to his friend's speech is going to reframe the entire silence in a way that changes how you understand it. For now, though, we are still in it. And the question the silence forces onto the table is one that every person of faith eventually has to answer for themselves. What do you believe about God when you cannot feel God? Not what do you believe intellectually, in the abstract. In the safety of an ordinary week when nothing is pushing on your faith, what do you actually hold on to when the ordinary support structures of felt presence and answered prayer and the general sense that God is near are not available to you? Because those structures are not always available, any honest account of the life of faith has to make room for seasons when they are not there. The Psalms are full of those seasons. Jeremiah lived in one for most of his ministry. The disciples sat in one for 3 days between a Friday and a Sunday. The silence of God is not a malfunction in the system of faith. It is one of the system's most demanding features. Job discovered this the hard way. He did not have a theology of divine silence that prepared him for it. He had a theology of divine presence and divine justice and divine responsiveness. And when the silence came and refused to leave, he had to find a way to hold on to his faith using resources that had not been designed for this particular test. He did not do it perfectly, but he did it. He kept talking to a God who was not answering. He kept filing the lawsuit with a court that had gone dark. He kept holding the tension between what he believed about God and what his experience seemed to be telling him, refusing to resolve it in either direction. Refusing to decide that God was not just because the silence felt unjust, and also refusing to decide that the silence was fine and everything was actually okay when it clearly was not. That is a very difficult thing to do, and it is very close to the thing that faith actually requires in the hardest seasons. Just the refusal to let go. Job had that. He held on with everything he had and said things he should not have said and went further than he should have gone in some of his claims. And God, who saw all of it, who watched the whole painful argument play out across those chapters, said at the end that man told the truth about me. The silence of God is not the same as the absence of God. Job learned that not easily, not quickly, not without enormous cost. But the book that carries his name has been sitting in the canon for thousands of years, specifically because the people who read it recognized something true in it. The silence you are sitting in right now, if you are sitting in one, is not the end of the story. It is chapter 9. There is a fourth man in this story that most people forget about. His name is Elihu. He is younger than Job and younger than the 3 friends. He has been sitting there the entire time, listening to the whole argument play out. And he has not said anything, because the older men were speaking and he was waiting his turn. But now the 3 friends have stopped. They have run out of arguments. Job has refused every verdict they offered him, and they have nothing left to say. And Elihu, who has been holding everything he wanted to say while the older men talked, is angry. He is angry at Job for justifying himself rather than God. And he is angry at the 3 friends for failing to answer Job while still condemning him. That second anger is interesting. Elihu sees what we have seen. He watches Eliphaz and Bildad and Zophar condemn Job without actually answering the questions Job is raising. He finds that insufficient. He thinks someone needs to actually engage with what Job is saying rather than just repeating the verdict more loudly each time. So, Elihu speaks. For 6 chapters. Longer than any single speech by any other character in the book. And here is where it gets complicated. Because Elihu is not entirely wrong. He makes arguments the 3 friends never made. He talks about God speaking to people through dreams and visions, through illness, through near-death experiences, as ways of getting their attention and redirecting their path. He talks about God as a teacher, not just a judge. Someone who uses suffering as a form of instruction rather than simply punishment. He says that God is not required to give an accounting to anyone. that the sheer vastness of who God is places him beyond the framework of a human lawsuit. These are real theological moves. They are better than what the three friends offered. They engage with Job's situation in a more nuanced way. And significantly, when God speaks at the end of the book and rebukes Eliphaz and his two friends for not speaking the truth about him, Elihu is not mentioned. God does not rebuke Elihu, which has led some readers to conclude that Elihu was right. But God does not confirm Elihu either. God does not say, "Well done, young man, you got it." God does not quote Elihu or affirm his arguments, or suggest that if Job had simply listened to Elihu, the whole conversation could have been resolved. When God appears, he speaks directly to Job and addresses the situation directly. And Elihu is simply not part of that conversation at all. It is one of the strangest silences in a book full of significant silences. What do we do with a voice that is not rebuked, but also not confirmed? What do we do with a theology that is closer to right than the alternatives, but still does not get the final word? Elihu represents something very specific. He represents the almost answer, the response to suffering that is more sophisticated and more thoughtful and more theologically careful than the obvious wrong answers. But that still falls short of the truth that only comes from a different kind of encounter altogether. There are Elihus in every generation, people who have thought more carefully about suffering than the simple comfort theology crowd, people who have read more, wrestled more, arrived at more nuanced positions, people who can tell you about formative suffering and redemptive pain and how God uses hard seasons to shape people into something they could not have become any other way. And they are not wrong. Exactly. There is real truth in what they say. But there is a difference between a theology of suffering that someone has constructed through careful thinking and a theology of suffering that someone has walked through in the dark without a map. Elihu had the first kind. Job was being forced into the second kind. And the second kind does not come from a speech. It comes from an encounter. This is why Elihu, for all his superiority to the three friends, cannot actually help Job. He can refine the argument. He can push the conversation to a higher level. He can say things that are closer to true. But he cannot give Job what Job actually needs, because what Job needs is not a better argument. Job needs to hear from God, not about God. Not a more sophisticated human analysis of what God might be doing in this situation. Not a carefully reasoned theological framework for understanding how suffering fits into a larger divine economy. From God, directly, personally, in a form that could not be mistaken for anything else. And Elihu, for all his words, cannot provide that. No human voice can provide that. The almost answer, no matter how close it gets, is still not the answer. There is something worth sitting with here for anyone who has spent time in religious communities while going through a hard season. Explanation is not encounter. Closer to right is not the same as right. And the gap between a sophisticated theology of suffering and the actual presence of God in the middle of your suffering is a gap that no amount of theological sophistication can close. Elihu speaks for 6 chapters, and then the whirlwind comes, and everything changes. Not because Elihu was refuted. He was not refuted. But because the voice that speaks from the whirlwind is not a better argument. It is a different category of thing entirely. Even the almost right answer is not the same as the voice from the whirlwind. Then the Lord spoke to Job out of the storm. That is how it begins. No warning, no announcement, no angel arriving ahead of time to say, "Brace yourself." This is about to happen. The whirlwind simply comes, and out of it, God speaks. And the first thing God says is a question. Who is this that obscures my plans with words without knowledge? Not a greeting, not a comfort, not an explanation of what happened and why. A question directed at Job. After everything Job has been through, after all the silence, after all the waiting, the first thing God says is a question. Where were you when I laid the earth's foundation? Tell me, if you understand, who marked off its dimensions. Surely you know, who stretched a measuring line across it. On what were its footings set, or who laid its cornerstone, while the morning stars sang together and all the angels shouted for joy? Where were you when I laid the earth's foundation? This is the moment that requires the most care of any moment in the entire book, because it is the moment that is most often misread. The standard misreading goes like this. God shows up and essentially tells Job to be quiet. God overwhelms him with divine power and cosmic scale and basically says, "You are too small to ask the questions you have been asking. So stop asking them." The message in this misreading is that human beings should not expect answers, should not press their case, should accept their suffering in silence, because the gap between human understanding and divine understanding is too vast to bridge. That reading is wrong. God is not telling Job to be quiet. God is expanding Job's vision. There is a difference between those two things. A teacher who silences a student and a teacher who takes a student outside the walls of the classroom and shows them something they have never seen before are doing completely different things. One is shutting down the conversation. The other is opening it up in a direction the student did not know was available. What God does from the whirlwind is the second of those things. He takes Job on a tour of creation, not to humiliate him, to show him something. Have you entered the storehouses of the snow, or seen the storehouses of the hail, which I reserve for times of trouble, for days of war and battle? What is the way to the place where the lightning is dispersed, or the place where the east winds are scattered over the earth? Who cuts a channel for the torrents of rain, and a path for the thunderstorm, to water a land where no one lives, an uninhabited desert, to satisfy a desolate wasteland and make it sprout with grass? Who waters a land where no one lives? Think about that image. God is describing rain falling on a desert that no human being ever sees. Care extended to places that have no audience, no witness, no one to notice or benefit or report back. The universe God describes from the whirlwind is not a universe organized around human observation. It is vast and intricate and operating on scales and in places that human beings are not even present to see. And Job is being invited to see it. Can you bind the chains of the Pleiades? Can you loosen Orion's belt? Can you bring forth the constellations in their seasons, or lead out the bear with its cubs? Do you know the laws of the heavens? Can you set up God's dominion over the earth? The Pleiades, Orion, the bear, constellations that were ancient when Job was alive, that sailors and farmers had navigated by for generations, that represented the fixed and reliable order of the night sky. God is pointing to them and asking, can you do this? Can you run this? Do you understand the mechanism by which this works? Not to crush Job, to locate him. Because Job, in the intensity of his suffering, had contracted his world down to the ash heap. His vision had narrowed, as suffering always narrows vision, to the immediate experience of his own pain. his own loss, his own unanswered questions. That narrowing was not a moral failure. It was a human response to unbearable circumstances. You cannot be expected to contemplate the Pleiades when your children are dead and your body is in agony. But God is widening Job's vision back out. He is saying, there is more happening than what is happening to you. There is a universe here that was running before you arrived and will be running after you are gone. And it is being held together by someone who knows what they are doing. And that someone is the same one you have been filing your lawsuit against. Then God goes further. He moves from the cosmos to the creatures. Do you hunt the prey for the lioness and satisfy the hunger of the lions when they crouch in their dens or lie in wait in a thicket? Who provides food for the raven when its young cry out to God and wander about for lack of food? Lions, ravens, creatures that live entirely outside the human moral economy, that are not rewarded for righteousness or punished for sin, that simply live and hunt and feed and die in the wild places of the earth. And God provides for them. Who provides food for the raven? That question is carrying more than it appears to carry. It is saying my care is not limited to the categories you have built for it. My attention is not confined to the framework your theology has constructed. I am present in places and to creatures and in ways that your system of understanding was never large enough to contain. Then comes Behemoth. Then comes Leviathan. These are the great creatures of the ancient world, the ones that represented chaos and power beyond human control. The ones that made human beings feel small and fragile in the face of a natural order that did not organize itself around human comfort or human safety. God describes them in detail: the strength of Behemoth's loins, the power of Leviathan's breath, the scales that close together so tight that no air can pass between them. God does not describe these creatures with fear or with the desire to control. He describes them with something that sounds almost like pride. Look at Behemoth, which I made along with you. Along with you, Job and Behemoth, made by the same hands, held in the same care, existing within the same created order. And through all of it, the Whirlwind speech is doing something to the question Job has been asking. Job's question, underneath all the speeches and the lawsuit and the lament, was essentially this: does my suffering mean that God does not care about me? Does the silence mean that God has forgotten me? Does the fact that I cannot find an explanation mean that there is no one holding this together? God does not answer those questions by giving Job a reason for his suffering. He answers them by showing Job who he is. And here is what that changes. If the God who holds the morning stars and feeds the raven and knows the storehouses of snow is the same God who has been present in Job's silence, then the silence was never emptiness. It was presence that did not announce itself. It was care operating on a scale that Job's pain-narrowed vision could not see. God does not give Job a smaller explanation. He gives him a larger world. And Job, who has been waiting for an answer, who has been pressing his case through chapter after chapter of argument and silence and more silence, looks at the God speaking from the whirlwind and understands something he could not have understood from the ash heap. The one holding the universe is the same one he has been talking to all along. That is not a comfort that makes the pain disappear. Job's children are still dead. His suffering is still real. The explanation he asked for is still not coming. But it is a different kind of answer than the one he asked for. And it is the only kind of answer that is actually large enough for the question. Job is not silenced by the whirlwind. He is found by it. Job speaks after the whirlwind, and what he says is short. My ears had heard of you, but now my eyes have seen you. That is it. That is the turning point of the entire book. Not a theological argument. Not a resolution of the questions he raised. Not a moment where God explains everything that happened, and Job nods and says yes. Now I understand. Now it all makes sense. Just that. Before, I had heard about you. Now I have seen you. Sit with the difference between those two things for a moment. Because the distance between hearing about someone and actually meeting them is one of the most significant distances in human experience. You can know everything about a person. Their history, their character, their reputation, the things people say about them, and still be caught completely off guard by who they actually are when you are standing in front of them. Job had a theology before the ash heap. It was a real theology, a serious one, built from years of faithful living and careful attention to what he believed about God. He was not a shallow man with a superficial faith. He was blameless and upright, and he thought deeply about what it meant to live in relationship with God. But it was a theology built from what he had heard, from tradition, from the accumulated wisdom of his community, from the way things had always been explained to him, and the way his own experience of blessing had seemed to confirm those explanations. His faith was genuine, but it was the faith of a man who had mostly known God in favorable conditions. The ash heap changed the conditions, and the whirlwind changed the faith. Not by replacing it with something different, by taking it somewhere deeper than it had been before, by moving it from the category of what Job had been told about God into the category of what Job had personally encountered. This is what Job means when he says, "Now my eyes have seen you." He is describing an encounter so direct and so personal that the word seeing is the only one that comes close to capturing it. He came face to face with the actual God rather than the description of God. And the actual God turned out to be both more than Job expected and different than Job expected. More vast and more wild and more present and more personal all at once. And that encounter, not an explanation, is what changes Job. This is the truth at the center of the whirlwind speech that is so easy to miss because we come to the book of Job looking for an answer, and the book of Job gives us a presence instead. Job wanted to know why. He wanted the chart, the timeline, the cause and effect breakdown of how a man who did everything right ended up in an ash heap. He wanted what any of us would want in his situation. The information that would allow suffering to be understood rather than simply endured. God did not give him that. God gave him something harder and better than that. He gave Job himself. And the staggering claim that the book makes, the claim that is either true, meaningless, is that the presence was sufficient. Not comfortable, not painless, but sufficient. Enough to change the way Job held everything that had happened to him. Not by explaining it, but by relocating it within a relationship that turned out to be real in a way that the silence had almost convinced Job it was not. Before the whirlwind, Job was pressing his case against a God who seemed absent. After the whirlwind, Job is standing in front of a God who was never absent, whose silence was not the silence of vacancy, but the silence of something Job had no framework for yet, and who has now shown up in a way that is unmistakable and personal and direct. Job does not receive the map of his suffering. He receives the presence he feared had disappeared. And somehow, in a way that the book does not try to explain or systematize or reduce to a principle, that is enough. Not because the pain was small, not because the losses did not matter, Not because the questions Job raised were not real questions worth raising. They were. The book takes them seriously in a way that most treatments of suffering do not. But because the presence was real, our culture tells us we need answers. We need closure. We need the narrative to resolve, the arc to complete, the story to arrive at a point where the pieces fit together into something that can be understood and filed away and moved past. We have entire industries built around providing those things, and some of that is genuinely good and genuinely helpful. Understanding things matters. Processing things matters. But Job is saying that there is a level of suffering where understanding is not available, where the explanation does not come, where the arc does not resolve in the way you need it to resolve. And in that place, the only thing that is actually large enough to meet the suffering is not a better explanation. It is the presence of the one who holds the explanation. Job gets that presence. He gets it in the middle of a whirlwind, which is not the way most people would choose to receive it. He gets it in a form that raises more questions than it answers. He gets it without the explanation he asked for, and without the closure his culture would have told him he needed. And he says, "Now my eyes have seen you." There is a faith that exists before the ash heap. It is real faith. It is worth having. It carries people through ordinary hard seasons and keeps them oriented toward God in the normal difficulties of a human life. And there is a faith that exists after the whirlwind. It has been tested in a way that the first kind has not. It has survived something that should have destroyed it. It has come out the other side of a silence that felt like abandonment and discovered that the silence was not what it felt like. It has met the actual God rather than the description of God. That second kind of faith does not look like the first kind. It is quieter in some ways and more certain in others. It does not make claims it cannot back up. It does not offer easy answers to other people's suffering because it knows what it costs to sit in the ash heap and wait for the whirlwind. It does not pretend that presence is the same as explanation. But it also knows, from the inside, that presence is something the explanation can never fully be. Job comes through the whirlwind with that second kind of faith. Not because God explained everything, because God showed up. Now comes the moment that most treatments of Job mention briefly and move past quickly. It should not be moved past quickly. After the whirlwind, after Job has spoken and said, "Now my eyes have seen you," after everything, God turns to Eliphaz and says something that lands like a verdict in a court that has been running for the entire book. "I am angry with you and your two friends, because you have not spoken the truth about me, as my servant Job has." Read that again. "I am angry with you, because you have not spoken the truth about me," not Job. Eliphaz and Bildad and Zophar, the three men who arrived with their theology intact and their answers ready. The three men who quoted tradition and shared visions and made careful arguments about divine justice and human sinfulness. The three men who, of everyone in this story, most consistently sounded like they knew what they were talking about. God is angry with them. And the reason God is angry with them is not that they were atheists or apostates or people who rejected him. The reason God is angry with them is that they spoke about him and they were wrong. They used his name and his character in the service of an argument that was not true. They defended a version of God that the actual God does not recognize. This is one of the most startling moments in the entire Bible. God is not rebuking the doubters or the questioners or the ones who pushed against the system. He is rebuking the defenders, the ones who came to argue for him. the ones who arrived at Job's side with the intention of protecting divine justice and explaining divine ways and making sure that God came out of this situation looking orderly and fair. God says, "You were wrong about me, and my servant Job was right." Now think about what Job actually said. Job said things in those middle chapters that would get him escorted out of most churches. He said he felt hunted. He said he wished he had never been born. He said he wanted to argue his case before God, and he was not sure God would listen fairly. He said things about divine injustice that his friends found outrageous and dangerously close to what they called blasphemy. And God says he was telling the truth about me. Not that Job's theology was technically perfect. Job overstated things. He went further than his knowledge warranted in places. But underneath all of it, Job was engaged in something his friends never managed. He was talking honestly to the actual God about his actual experience. He was not performing faith. He was not managing the presentation of his grief to make it acceptable to the people around him. He was not choosing words that would protect God's reputation at the expense of his own honesty. He brought what was real to the one who is real. And God calls that truth. His friends brought what was theologically tidy, what fit the system, what preserved the framework and kept the divine reputation intact and made sure that the moral order of the universe remained legible and manageable. And God calls that a lie. There is something here that should make every person who has ever sat in a pew or led a Bible study or offered comfort to a suffering person deeply uncomfortable. Because the failure of Job's friends was not a failure of knowledge. It was a failure of honesty. And it was a failure they committed in the name of faithfulness. They were defending God. That was their intention. They believed that justifying God's ways and maintaining the integrity of divine justice was the most faithful thing they could do in this situation. They were not trying to harm Job. They were trying to honor God. And God tells them they did neither. What God honors, apparently, is not the careful protection of a theological system. What God honors is the honest voice of a person who keeps talking to him even when the talking is messy and the theology is imperfect and the words come out raw and sometimes wrong. What God honors is the refusal to perform a faith you do not currently have in order to satisfy the people around you. Job performed nothing. He said what he actually thought and felt and believed and feared, directly to God and in front of everyone, without editing it for palatability. And God, looking at all of it, says, "That man told the truth about me." This has enormous implications for how we talk to people who are suffering. The instinct, especially in communities of faith, is to guide suffering people toward the right theological framework, to make sure they are interpreting their experience correctly, to gently redirect language that sounds too angry or too despairing or too close to the edge of what feels like acceptable faith. We do this because we believe we are helping. We do this because, like Job's friends, we care about the person in front of us, and we want both of those things to come out okay. But what if the most faithful thing we can do for a suffering person is exactly what Job's friends did for the first 7 days and then stopped doing? What if the most faithful thing is to sit down in the ash heap with them and let their lament be what it actually is, without trying to fix it or redirect it or make sure it sounds like the kind of grief that God can work with? Because apparently, God can work with the kind of grief that does not sound acceptable. He worked with Job's. He called it truth. God is not honored by false certainty spoken over someone else's pain. He is honored by the person who kept talking to him even when the answers stopped coming. He is honored by the faith that refuses to perform okayness it does not have. He is honored by the lament that is too honest and too loud and too persistent for the people around it to be comfortable with. That is Job. And God says so. There is a restoration coming. Job's friends will sacrifice, and Job will pray for them, and God will accept the prayer. The relationship between them will not end in condemnation. Grace is part of this story too. For the friends who got it wrong, as much as for Job, who struggled to get it right. But before the restoration, God says what he says. He is angry with the defenders, and he calls the honest sufferer his servant. 4 times, my servant Job. It was true at the beginning, before the suffering started. It is still true now. On the other side of everything, after the ash heap and the lawsuit and the whirlwind and the words that went too far in the middle chapters, my servant Job, the designation that God spoke before Job lost a single thing, is the same designation God speaks after Job went through all of it. He did not stop being God's servant when the suffering came. He did not lose the title when his theology got rough around the edges in the ash heap. He did not forfeit the relationship when his lament was too loud for his friends to handle. My servant Job. That is what honesty with God looks like from God's side of the conversation. It looks like a relationship that does not break under the weight of the questions you bring to it. After the whirlwind, after God rebukes the 3 friends, after Job prays for the men who spent chapter after chapter trying to convince him his suffering was his fault, after all of that, God restores Job. The Lord restored his fortunes and gave him twice as much as he had before. All his brothers and sisters and everyone who had known him before came and ate with him in his house. They comforted him and consoled him over all the trouble the Lord had brought on him. Each one gave him a piece of silver and a gold ring. He had 14,000 sheep, 6,000 camels, 1,000 yoke of oxen, and 1,000 donkeys, twice what he had before. The numbers are exact and deliberate. The restoration is real, and it is generous, and it is specific. He had 7 sons and 3 daughters. 7 sons and 3 daughters. The same numbers as before. And his daughters, the text tells us, were the most beautiful women in all the land. He gave them an inheritance along with their brothers, which was unusual for that time and says something about the kind of man Job had become on the other side of everything he went through. He lived 140 years after this. He saw his children and their children to the 4th generation. And Job died, an old man and full of years. This is how the book ends, with blessing and longevity and beauty, and an old man dying full of years, surrounded by 4 generations of people who came from him. If you read it fast, it looks like a happy ending. And in one sense, it is. The restoration is real. Do not minimize it. Do not read it cynically as if God is simply trying to tie up loose ends or make the story feel complete. The restoration matters. It is part of what the book is saying about who God is and how God relates to the people he calls his own. Job suffered enormously, and then Job flourished. Both of those things are true, and both of them matter. But here is what the ending does not say. It does not say that Job forgot. It does not say that the new children erased the grief for the ones who died. It does not say that the 14,000 new sheep made the loss of the original 7,000 feel like a math problem that had been corrected. It does not say that the 140 years of blessing cancelled out the season of ashes. That the joy of watching 4 generations grow up around him meant the ash heap was something he eventually stopped thinking about. The text is silent about all of that, and the silence is honest. Because any parent who has lost a child knows that you do not stop being the parent of that child, because other children come after. The grief changes. It finds a place in you over time. It does not consume every waking moment the way it did in the early days. Life does go on, and there is real joy in the going on. But the child who died is still the child who died. They do not become less real because the years pass and other children come and the ordinary rhythms of living reassert themselves. Job had 10 children at the beginning of the story. They died. Then he had 10 more. And the book presents both of those things without asking us to average them out into something manageable. This matters enormously for how we talk about restoration. There is a version of Job's ending that gets preached in a lot of places that goes something like this. Job was faithful. Job endured. God saw it. God blessed him. The blessing was double what he had before. And that is what happens when you hold on through the hard season. Trust the process. The double blessing is coming. Your restoration is on the way. That version is not wrong about everything. God did restore Job. The blessing was real. Holding on through the hard season is worth doing. But that version treats the ending like a solution. Like the final chapter resolves the problem the earlier chapters raised. Like the new children and the new sheep and the new prosperity add up to an answer that makes the suffering make sense. And they do not. The suffering does not make sense at the end of Job in the way that we usually want suffering to make sense. We want it to have been worth it in a calculable way. We want to be able to look at the outcome and say, given what he received, the suffering was justified. A transaction completed. A price paid for something of equal or greater value. But Job's children who died were not a price. They were people. They were his sons and daughters who ate together at his oldest brother's house, and whom Job prayed for every morning, and who were real and specific and irreplaceable in the way that all people are irreplaceable. And the text does not tell us that Job stopped missing them. What the text tells us is that Job lived. He kept living. He planted seeds, and they grew. He watched grandchildren be born, and great-grandchildren, and children of great-grandchildren. He ate meals and had conversations, and experienced the ordinary texture of a long life continuing to unfold around him. He was an old man full of years, not full of answers, not finally at peace with a complete understanding of what happened to him and why. Not standing on the other side of a resolved theology of suffering that made the ash heap feel like a chapter he had fully closed. Full of years. There is something in that phrase that is more honest than most of us want our endings to be. We want resolution. We want the story to close in a way that makes the opening chapters feel like they were building towards something that justified them. We want the suffering to have a purpose that we can name and point to and say there. That is why it happened. And now that we have the why, we can make peace with the what. Job does not get that. And the book does not pretend he does. What Job gets is life on the other side of the grief. Real life. Full life. Life with 14,000 sheep and beautiful daughters and 4 generations of family and 140 years of ordinary days, stacking up into something that looks, from the outside, like flourishing. And somewhere in all of those ordinary days, the man who sat in the ash heap and scraped his own skin with broken pottery and cursed the day of his birth and filed a lawsuit against God and met him in a whirlwind and said, "Now my eyes have seen you." That man is in there too. In the old man who is full of years. In the father who gives his daughters an inheritance. In the person who prayed for the friends who accused him. The ash heap does not disappear from the story just because the fields are full again. The graves do not go away just because new life fills the house. But the house is full. And the man who did not know if he would survive the silence survived it. More than survived it. He lived forward into a fullness that the ash heap, in its worst moments, would have made it impossible to imagine. Restoration is not the erasure of grief. It is life continuing on the other side of it. The graves are real, and the new life is real. And Job held both of those things for 140 years without the book asking him to choose between them, without requiring him to either forget the dead or refuse the living. He held them both. And if you are in your own version of the ash heap right now, that is what the ending of Job is actually offering you. Not a promise that the grief will be explained. Not a guarantee that the losses will be replaced in a way that makes the math work out. Not a neat resolution that turns the suffering into a stepping stone to something so good it was worth it. Just this: the story did not end in the ashes. Job's did not. And the same God who was present in the whirlwind when Job could not find him in the silence. The same God who fed ravens and counted stars and asked who marked off the dimensions of the earth. That God did not leave Job in the ash heap. He did not leave him there. That is not a small thing to know. In the worst moments of the worst seasons, when the silence is so complete you cannot remember what the presence felt like. When the grief is so heavy, you cannot see past it to anything that looks like a future. It is not a small thing to know that the ash heap is not where the story ends. It did not end there for Job. Hold on to that. There is something Job did not know. He did not know it while he sat in the ash heap. He did not know it while his friends argued with him. He did not know it when the whirlwind came and God spoke and Job said, "Now my eyes have seen you." He did not know it while he prayed for his friends and God restored his fortunes and his daughters were born and his grandchildren and his great-grandchildren came into the world. He never found out. Back in chapter 2 of this book, before the first disaster arrived, there was a conversation that happened in a place Job could not see. God and the accuser, and a question about whether Job's faith was the kind that could survive without the blessings that had always accompanied it. God agreeing to remove the hedge. God permitting what was about to happen. Job never knew any of that. He never knew that his name was the one God brought up. He never knew that his faith was the one God pointed to when the accuser came to present himself before the divine council. He never knew that the question being explored through his suffering was not whether he deserved punishment, but whether his love for God was rooted in God himself or in what God had given him. He never knew he was at the center of a question that mattered. He never knew that God called him blameless and upright before the test began. That God was already on record about who Job was before a single disaster arrived. He never knew that God had said, "There is no one on earth like him." That the same God who seemed so absent during all those chapters of silence had spoken of him with what sounds almost like pride before any of it started. He never knew. And when God appeared in the whirlwind and spoke at length about the foundations of the earth and the storehouses of snow and the chains of the Pleiades and the habits of the war horse, God did not take that opportunity to explain. He did not say, "Here is what happened. Here is why. Here is the conversation that took place before you lost everything. Here is how your suffering fit into something larger than you could see from the ash heap." He did not tell Job any of that. Job left the whirlwind without a map of his suffering. He received the presence. He received the restoration. He received 140 years of life and 4 generations of family and the testimony of God himself that he had spoken the truth. He received all of that. He never received the explanation. And this, more than anything else in the book of Job, is the thing that our culture least knows how to sit with. We live in a world that treats explanation as a right. Transparency is a value. Closure is a therapeutic goal. The narrative arc is supposed to complete. People who have been through hard things are supposed to reach a point where they understand what happened to them well enough to integrate it and move forward with something that looks like peace and resolution. And sometimes that happens. Sometimes the understanding does come. Sometimes you can look back from a later vantage point and see something you could not see from inside the suffering. Some shape to the story that makes a kind of sense. Some thread that connects the loss to something that came after it in a way that helps. But sometimes it does not happen. Sometimes you live 140 years and you never find out why. Sometimes the explanation that would make the suffering bearable in a cognitive sense simply does not arrive. Sometimes the closure that your culture tells you to seek is not available. Not because something went wrong with the process. Not because you did not heal correctly or grieve correctly or pray correctly, but because the closure was never part of what was being offered. Job is the patron saint of people who never found out why. And what Job's life says to those people is not that the lack of explanation means God was absent or indifferent, or that the suffering was meaningless. What Job's life says is that it is possible to live fully, to live well, to live forward into beauty and family and flourishing, without ever receiving the map you asked for. Job's journey to that place was one of the most costly journeys in Scripture. He did not arrive at the 140 years of fullness by skipping past the ash heap. He went through it, every chapter of it. The 7 days of silence with his friends and the arguments that followed, and the lawsuit and the whirlwind and the encounter with a God who showed up without explaining himself. He went through all of it and came out the other side without the answer he originally demanded. And he lived. That is not a small thing. That is, in some ways, the most demanding thing the book of Job asks of its readers. Not that you accept an explanation for your suffering. Not that you find a framework that makes it make sense. Not that you arrive at a place of intellectual peace with the theology of divine sovereignty and human suffering. Just that you consider the possibility that Job walked through. The possibility that presence is not the same as explanation. That encounter is not the same as understanding. That a God who shows up without answering all your questions is still a God who showed up, and that showing up, in the end, was what Job needed most, even if it was not what Job asked for. Closure is not what God promised. Presence is what God promised. And Job, who never read the prologue of his own story, who never knew the conversation that set everything in motion, who went to his grave without the explanation that would have satisfied the questions of his worst days in the ash heap, Job still said at the end of it, "Now my eyes have seen you." That was enough for him. Not because the questions were not real. They were real. Not because the losses were not devastating. They were devastating. Not because the silence was not the hardest thing he ever endured. It was, but because the God he met in the whirlwind turned out to be real in a way that the silence had almost convinced him to stop believing. And real, in the end, was enough. You may be in a season right now where the explanation has not come, where you have prayed the prayer and done the work and sat in the ash heap and waited, and the whirlwind has not arrived yet. Or it arrived, and it did not answer the question you brought to it. Job understands that season from the inside. And what Job's life says, across 140 years of living forward, after the worst thing that ever happened to him, is this: you do not need the explanation to keep living. You need the presence. And the presence, the same presence that was there when the morning stars sang together, and the sea poured out from its gates, and the ravens cried out for food in the wild places of the earth. That presence has not abandoned you in the ash heap. It did not abandon Job there. And the same God who called him blameless before the suffering started, who called him my servant through all of it, who met him in the whirlwind without explaining himself and restored him without erasing the grief. That God knows where you are right now. He knew where Job was. He knows where you are, and he has not forgotten. Job is gone now. The ash heap is empty. The arguments have stopped. The whirlwind has passed. The fields are full again, and the house is full again, and the old man who was full of years has gone the way of everyone who has ever lived. What remains is what always remains. After a story this honest has passed through a room. Questions that did not get answered. Grief that did not get explained. And underneath all of it, something quieter and more durable than either of those things. 6 truths. The kind you do not write down and file away and feel settled about. The kind you carry. The kind that changes the shape of how you see. Not because they solved anything, but because they were still standing when everything easy had fallen down. Job left these behind, not intentionally, just by living through what he lived through and refusing to lie about any of it. The first truth: the righteous can suffer without a simple reason. This is the truth that every comfortable theology has to find a way around. Job makes that impossible. The text establishes his righteousness before the first disaster arrives. Not as background detail, but as the entire point. The story only works if you cannot explain away what happens to this man by pointing to something he did wrong. This truth does not give you a lever to pull to prevent suffering. It does not hand you a checklist that guarantees protection. What it does is remove the cruelest layer of suffering. The layer that says this is happening because of something wrong with you. Sometimes it is not. Sometimes the person sitting in the ash heap did everything right. And the most faithful thing anyone can do for them is refuse to look for the reason that keeps your theology safe at their expense. The second truth: sometimes the deepest wound is not the loss itself. It is the silence that follows. Job lost his children. He lost his health. He lost the life he had built. Those losses were real and enormous, and the book does not minimize any of them. But the chapters that carry the most weight are the silence chapters. The ones where Job speaks into a sky that does not answer. The ones where the lawsuit is filed and the court does not open. The silence is not evidence of absence. Job discovered that, but it does not feel that way from inside it. And the book of Job is one of the few places in all of religious literature that takes that feeling seriously without rushing to resolve it. The silence is hard. It is allowed to be hard. And the God who eventually spoke from the whirlwind was present in the silence too. Even when Job could not feel it and could not prove it and could not do anything except keep talking to a sky that was not answering. The third truth: easy answers spoken over open wounds are the defense of a theology that cannot afford to be wrong. Job's friends were afraid men, not bad men. They needed Job's suffering to have a reason, because a world where suffering has no reason is a world where none of us are safe. So they found the reason. They built it carefully out of real theological materials and presented it with genuine concern and absolute certainty. And they were wrong. God said so. The most dangerous thing you can bring to a person who is suffering is not cruelty. Cruelty at least announces itself. The most dangerous thing is certainty. the settled conviction that you know what God is doing in someone else's ash heap. And the most faithful response to suffering is the one Job's friends managed for exactly 7 days before they ruined it. Sit down. Stay. Say nothing. The fourth truth. Honest lament is not the opposite of faith. It may be the most honest form of it. Job said things in those middle chapters that make people uncomfortable. Things that sound dangerously close to accusation, to anger at God, to a faith that is fraying at the edges and refusing to stay presentable. And God, at the end of all of it, said that man told the truth about me. The Bible does not erase the voice of the suffering person. It preserves it. The Psalms are full of lament. Jeremiah lamented, Job lamented, and every one of those voices was kept in the canon, because that voice is true in a way that performed peace is not, because a God who is real can handle what is real. If your prayers sound more like arguments than devotions right now, if the things you are saying to God in private are things you would not say in public because they do not sound like the kind of faith that gets celebrated in the places you practice your faith. Job says one thing to you: keep talking. The fifth truth. God's answer to suffering is not always an explanation. Sometimes it is a presence, and the presence is the answer. Job wanted to know why. God gave him the whirlwind instead. A larger world, not a smaller answer. A meeting with the one who holds the map, not the map itself. The presence he feared had disappeared. Not the explanation, he demanded. And Job said, now my eyes have seen you. That is not a resolution. It is an encounter with a God who turned out to be real even in the silence, who was present even when the presence could not be felt, who showed up without explaining himself and was exactly what Job needed, even though he was not at all what Job asked for. Your questions matter. Job's questions mattered. God took them seriously enough to answer them personally, out of a whirlwind. At length, with the full weight of creation behind every word. But the answer came as presence, not as information. And if you are waiting for an explanation that will make your suffering finally make sense, what the book of Job offers instead is a God who shows up in the middle of things that do not make sense and who is real enough, present enough, large enough to be worth finding even there. The sixth truth. Restoration is not the erasure of grief. It is life on the other side of it. Job's fields were full again. His house was full again. 4 generations of family surrounded him in his old age, and he died full of years. And the graves were still real. Both of those things are true. The book does not ask you to choose between them. It does not tell you to focus on the blessing and release the grief. It does not suggest that the restoration means the loss was really okay. It just tells you that Job lived, that after the ash heap there were 140 years, that after the silence there was a voice from the whirlwind, that after the grief that felt like the end of everything, there was more. The grief and the new life occupying the same person across the same years. Because that is what actually happens to people who survive the thing they thought would end them. They keep living. The ash heap is real. And it is not the last word. That is what Job leaves behind. 6 things that were still standing when everything easy had fallen down. 6 truths that survived the ash heap. The book of Job does not explain suffering by making it smaller. It changes how we see suffering by showing what remains when every easy answer fails. Job is not the story of a man who finally understood everything. It is the story of a man who met God after every easy answer had failed. And met God was enough. Share this with one person. You already thought of someone while you were watching. Someone who is in their own ash heap right now and needs to know that the ash heap is not the end of the story. Someone who has been handed easy answers that did not fit the weight of what they are carrying. Send it to them. Just send it. Leave a comment and tell me where you are in this story. The ash heap. The 7 days of silence with someone who stayed. The arguments that went nowhere. The whirlwind. The restoration that still hurts. Wherever you are, someone else is in the same place. And that is worth knowing. Subscribe if you have not already. This channel exists to take the people and books of Scripture seriously enough to tell the whole truth about them. The complicated truth, the truth that does not sand down the hard edges. The truth that makes the grace mean something because it does not pretend the suffering was simple. Job did not go through the ash heap alone. Neither do you.